a bit before this about how my work, in a way, is sort of a precursor to this Green New Deal that AOC has been talking about, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. For the last decade, we've been trying to really create WPA 2.0, I called it, really a way of reinventing our national infrastructure to make it greener. And I'm really encouraged that sort of the architectural community has kind of bought into the whole environmental movement, and that also I think that there is this kind of more fluid synthesis of design and environmental thinking. And let's see, the big green button is probably the one to use, right? So this talk, I'll call it Innovation to Implementation. It's really an overview of a few projects that I would say are case studies of the kinds of things that we're doing to try to implement change in the world, or in the design world, in the infrastructural world of landscape. So my practice started with a series of grant-financed prototypes, and each of these orange bands shows these grant-funded projects that were kind of more theoretical, and then the bands in white show projects that came out of that were real prototypes. And I did that because when I started my practice, I was a small woman-owned business, and I couldn't get the kinds of projects that I wanted to do, which were large infrastructure projects, which tended to go to large engineering firms and tended to be controlled by quite powerful public agencies that tended to work with the same old firms that they'd always worked for. So you can see how there's been this evolution of grant writing and doing these theoretical projects and then real projects. And some of them have actually been projects like this, the MoMA Rising Currents project, which was in the theoretical end, obviously, but we worked with Architecture Research Office to design a complete sort of revisioning of Lower Manhattan in the face of potential climate change impacts. So looking at preparing the city for a big storm event, which actually happened a few years later. So we did this by reinventing the infrastructure, by creating permeable streets and elevated edges, wetland perimeter, and really using all these systems to protect the city. And I think one of the things that was misunderstood about this project, that it was as much about an upland reinvention of the infrastructure by creating these permeable streets and putting all of the utilities into waterproof vaults, as it was about creating a big elevated edge around the perimeter. So a precursor to that project was actually the Gowanus Canal Sponge Park, and I think that's one of the reasons that we were asked to participate in MoMA. And we did this project in the Gowanus. It was a master plan for the Gowanus Canal area, which you can see is in Brooklyn. This is very familiar to me, but this is Brooklyn, Red Hook, and the Gowanus Canal. It's now an EPA Superfund site, and it's undergone a tremendous transformation over the last decade, but it's a highly regulated landscape where there are over 200 permits that you have to get for any waterfront project. And just as an example, in this diagram up in the upper right, the soil underneath the streets is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. The ground is controlled by the Department of Transportation, which owns it, which owns the ground, which owns the land. The landscape, the green stuff, is owned by the Parks Department. The water that flows over the ground is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. The shade over the water is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state agency. The sediment underneath the canal is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers, although that shifted over to being controlled by the EPA Superfund people. So anyway, it was hard to get anything done there, to say the least. But using grant funding and a pilot project and doing it outside of normal procurement processes with all these grants, we managed to get a pilot, which is a new form of green infrastructure. And this little street end, which may seem kind of inconsequential, can, except it took me 8 years to build because we're working in New York City in an EPA Superfund site, it absorbs about 2 million gallons of stormwater every year. And when you actually take that to scale across the city, you could control 800 million gallons of stormwater every year. And this is really important to the city because New York City is one of hundreds of cities across the United States that is under consent decree from the federal government because of their need to comply with EPA Clean Water Act rules. So there's tremendous potential here. Now this obviously applies to waterfront cities, but there are a lot of waterfront cities out there. So we're also working on trying to repair some of the really horrible things that happened because of the intersection of cities and interstate highways. Highways weren't originally designed to go through cities. They weren't designed in a really friendly way to intersect with urban communities. And this is actually a community in Lucerus, Brooklyn, where it was a community-initiated project, started with a woman named Diana Reyna, who brought us in to design this park over the highway, over the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. And we've gone to tremendous measures to both design the park and then even create a superhero to advocate for the park, because we've really been fighting for this for many, many years. We've had rallies out at City Hall and out on the edges of the BQE because the people in the neighborhood are being poisoned by the highway. And the city really should take action and do something about it. And building this park is one way to really not only improve that physical environment, but also to reduce some of the gang violence that's happening because of the rift that's created between these two sides of the highway that create a political boundary as much as they also create this environmental nuisance. So that's something we've really been trying to ameliorate. And then we not only work over highways, but also under highways. We worked with the Design Trust for Public Space, and we do this a lot. We work with not-for-profit entities to sort of further our projects. And in this case, we worked with the Design Trust and the Department of Transportation, so in this case also engaging with a public agency to make the prototypes become more real. In this case, we worked on the 666 miles of under the elevated spaces in New York City and tried to come up with replicable prototypes that could really be spread all around the city. In this case, this was Broadway Junction, trying to improve this, what is actually quite a beautiful but currently quite terrifying space, by improving some of the wayfinding and also trying to bring more natural conditions into the site. We bring a lot of the sort of smaller prototypes that we do with the grant funding. So in this case, this is a project we call Holds, where we've designed various systems for taking the water off of raised highways and bringing it into modular bioswales. I've gotten, a lot of money through grants to do various prototypes and worked with the GSA and the EPA and a lot of other sort of federal agencies to implement some of these projects. But so what we did was we took that work that had already been proven, and then we brought that to the Design Trust so that they could then bring it to the DOT so that it might actually become a rule or a new sort of standard procedure. And that's something that we're sort of chipping away at. We did that with the DEP, and we did that with the DOT as well. We're also looking at new agricultural systems. This was the Milan Expo for the USA Pavilion for the Milan Expo that we designed with Jim Bieber's office, looking at new agricultural systems for vertical farms, and then also looking at how you might transform public parking into new modes of public occupation. This was working in St. Louis. We're looking at rail-to-trail systems. This is the Queensway project. Actually, this is in AOC's backyard. This is her congressional district. It's a 3.5-mile long rail corridor through Queens that has a catchment of 322,000 people. And we like to think that this is the most diverse demographic of any urban trail in the world because it goes through so many different neighborhoods in Queens. we're also working in Hawaii. And in this case, developing prototypes for the University of Hawaii. Oops, sorry, I need to go back. Well, I won't, but University of Hawaii on a prototype, because I'll just mess up, on a prototypical campus that helps to improve the water quality of that zone so that we can set a prototype for downstream areas. And then finally, since I got the 1 minute, working with, and this is kind of coming full circle because in the first image I showed the MoMA Rising Currents project, and this is a project we did, almost 10 years later for the Regional Plan Association. And I would say that in this case, what we're advocating for is a slightly different approach. We're suggesting that we move people away from this vulnerable water line to areas that are out of danger, and that we then repurpose some of this area that is in this vulnerable coastal zone for different usage, for productive use, but different uses: energy, recreation, conservation, and habitation. And that in doing that, we're taking a lot of people who don't really have the ability to move out of, or putting them out of harm's way, but also creating new opportunity for those communities, and creating a new kind of coastal zone and a new coastal inhabitation, really a new coastal urbanism for the next century. And I do want to show this video, that's why I kind of went fast through those last ones, but because it kind of encapsulates the whole picture and what happens if you put it all together. And I guess it's a little hard to know. There you go. So thank you. That last project was Montreal, and it really was focused on transportation. But as you can see, so many of those larger infrastructure systems have had such an incredible impact on our environment that they provide an incredible resource for us to make change. Right. So, thank you.